Great. Well, this class was advertised as Study Skills 2, but I guess it would be worthwhile reviewing Study Skill 1 in order to give some background for that. Connor was here for Study Skill 1, but this is just a good example of another review, which I think is part of studying, so it won't be harmful, I hope. So let's go back and talk about the first approach to studying that I talked about in the spring. And basically the goal of study is assimilated knowledge. That is, and by assimilation I mean that when you study, you're not just trying to remember something for a set period of time, for instance, until a test. The goal is to assimilate the material so it's part of you. It's part of the way you look at the world and reality. And that way, it's always there to be used instead of something just to be dug out at a certain point from time to time. And a lot of people, unfortunately, do tend to study for tests. And so they're aiming at short-term regurgitation of information. And that has some benefits, and some of it may stick. But the problem is that a lot of it won't. That if you're just studying for the short term, you're likely to remember for the short term. And the kind of study I'm going to describe today is something that's aimed at assimilation, really making it part of you. And the goal here is that when you assimilate this bit of knowledge and this bit, you're constructing an overall view of reality. Because when you look at the world, you see it in the light of everything you've already learned. There's a phenomenon called selective perception, where when we look at the world, sometimes we focus on a particular part of it. You probably have noticed, somebody asks you, oh, you went by there, did you see such and such? And never saw such and such at all, because you were looking at something else. So what we're trying to do when we study broadly, not just study for a particular test or subject, is we're trying to accumulate a whole lot of knowledge that fits together in a way that helps us to see reality more whole, to see more of the parts of it. So we're not just focusing on one part and ignoring all the other parts. More and more, and maybe this is because of my own circumstances of moving from one city to another in the last year or two, I think a great analogy for this is the experience of moving to a new city and learning about that city and getting a feel for it. For example, when I first moved down here, I would hang out in certain places. For example, I did some activities at Duke and a few activities at UNC. We ended up, I stayed with a friend in Durham. Actually, where was he? He's.
Is it a darker marker by any chance? Just doesn't seem to show up.
Doesn't help much. I had a friend who lived in Durham. But then we ended up getting offices over on East Six Forks. And then once in a while, I'd go down to North Carolina State for activities there as well. And I found, and then I have a friend who lives up in North Raleigh. Go there sometimes. And what I was struck by is I would get to know the ins and outs of these particular roads and ways of getting place around Duke. A few things around UNC or Durham. But I'd have it in these little patches. And I'd only knew the little patches. I didn't really know how the patches related to each other. Another place I would sometimes come to is actually the Cathedral. So right around here, around Campbell. But what I found is I would leave this area here and drive toward North Carolina State, and I'd arrive at North Carolina State, and I'd be thinking, well, North Carolina State faces this way. But I'd show up and it faced that way. You know, I didn't have a sense for how the things fit together. But what happens is that over time, you start filling in all the things. Another great example is if you want to go from Six Forks to North Carolina State, what you typically do is you hop on 440, you come down, get off on either Western or Hillsborough. But of course, anybody who's been on 440 at 5 o'clock or 5:30 in the afternoon wants to say, basically, I don't want to go anywhere near 440. You know, and you know, our office isn't that far from North Carolina State, but this was like a complete blank to me. I had no idea where I'd be going, you know, at all. And now I'm doing it because I explore sometimes. You know, I try to find a place. Whoops, that's the wrong turn, whatever. And what's happening now is more and more these things are expanding, or I'm kind of, you know, I'm kind of filling in. And the result is, and I'm moving toward it, but not quite there yet, is eventually I'm going to have a pretty good idea of the triangle. You know, all the different parts to it. Life is like that is studying reality. You know, when we, you know, I guess the word that would be used typically today is worldview. It's the idea of kind of all the different things that you think or believe or understand or know and how they fit together. And it gives you a certain kind of perspective on reality. And of course, none of our views ever actually ends up being a perfect fit to reality, because there's lots of stuff we don't know. You know, it's not possible to know everything. But you can know a lot, and especially if you know the big picture, that can really be very, very helpful, because you put all the parts in a context. That's the goal of the study that I'm talking about. But in order to have that, you can't just know something in the sense you can walk to a book on the shelf and pull it out, or pull out your notebook. It's got to be inside you. That is, you have to have assimilated it. It has to have become part of you to really be operative, to really actually have an effect on the way you look at the world. So that's the goal. And as you can see from this analogy, it's not so much knowing this idea and this idea and this idea and then adding them up. Because it's not just isolated ideas, it's the way they fit together. There's this idea and this idea, but they're part of a larger whole. You know, so it's good to know about politics, but to know about politics, you have to know about sociology. To know about that politics, you have to know about history, because all these things affect each other. And if you just studied them in isolation and never kind of integrated them and put them together, you wouldn't really get a picture, a complete picture, which is what you're trying to get. So that's the goal. You know, this assimilated knowledge that gives us the big picture of how everything fits together, or at least as much as we're capable of grasping. Okay, so with this in mind, how should we go about studying things? And I'm going to start by focusing on reading and the way you ought to approach reading, let's say in your classes, when you're assigned material in various classes. And the eraser doesn't really erase very much, does it? The general movement I'm going to describe is a movement from the general to the particular back to the general. Or another way to describe it is to say you start by looking at the whole, then you look at the parts, and then you move back and you look at the whole. And I'll try to give a little bit of an explanation about why this kind of movement is the most useful one for studying. So let's start with, let's say you've been assigned a book or a part of a book to read for an assignment. and you're approaching it for the first time, where do you want to start out? What you want to start out with first is you want to get a general idea of the whole. Because when you look at the different parts, you want to be able to put the parts in a context that helps make more sense out of it. And so the first step is to get what you might call a vague idea or a general idea of the whole. You know, the first time around, there's no way you can take in everything about a subject the first time. You know, it would be just too much. It would overwhelm you. So you start off by getting a feel for the whole. Now, how might you do that when you read a book? You know, there are a number of things. What's the first thing you look at when you read a book? Yeah, read the back. The title. You know, what's the title of the book? Why is that the title? The table of contents. Yeah, that's really valuable because you can step back a little bit and get a little idea of the overall structure of what it is you're going to look at. If it's a chapter you have to read that night, you might page through and look at the subheadings because they're not always going to appear in the table of contents. And so you might get an idea, okay, these are the different kinds of questions that are going to appear in the reading. And then there's the reading, the first reading. And basically what you do is, I think the best thing to do is to push on through and read it once, preferably in one sitting if you can, if you have enough time for that, depending upon how big the assignment is. But you push through and read the whole thing. Some people say, and I suppose sometimes it works, that you can skim it. I think in general it's better if you can actually read it, although not kind of reading it slowly and carefully and kind of meditating on it. You know, the first time through, it's pushing through to really get a sense, at least a vague general sense, of the whole thing that you're studying. You know, for the complete picture. And I guess different people have different recommendations on this. My view is that if there are words you don't understand, you know, you ought to stop and look them up. You know, because you're trying to get some of the basics out of the way first time through, and so if there's a vocabulary word you don't understand, you know, then you look it up. If there's an historical event or a person that's referred to, and you don't have any idea who it is, well, you grab you know, I used to say you grab an encyclopedia. What do you do now? You just Google it, right, and maybe end up with Wikipedia or something. But you identify. At least you might say the basic English. You know, what does this mean in ordinary English? You know, and that means looking up words you don't know and looking up people and events and so forth. So that's something you have to do the first time around. That's kind of clearing the ground. You know, getting the basics done, even though you're not going to spend a lot of time on most of the parts. You're still aiming at the general picture. Now, another thing you can do from time to time is just stop for a moment and kind of say, okay, what's he said so far? You know, what's this writer said? And just, okay, this is the main point in this section, or okay, this is the main point of that section. Even just summarizing what you've just read, the last couple of pages, summarizing it in a sentence or two, just to kind of identify, you know, okay, what is it that we're talking about here? And how is the flow of the argument going? Now, this is the first reading, or the first step, you know, the general or the whole. Now, lamentably, there are many students who, if they do that, they think they've actually done a pretty good job because they see some of their friends who didn't bother reading the whole thing at all. You know, that they might have just, you know, literally skimmed it or picked out a few ideas, or maybe if it's a novel, they got some cliff notes or whatever. So sometimes people think they've actually really done a lot if they read the material once. The fact of the matter is that if you're really aiming at assimilated knowledge, not just something you might remember for a couple of days or a week, you really have to do a lot more than just one reading. The first reading is just the first step, and there's a long way to go. And in fact, I think in some ways the heart of the work and what you might call the grunt work is going to come in the second step of digging into the particulars, the parts of the whole, and learning about those parts. And as a practical matter, when you're reading, what that typically means is outlining. That is taking notes on what you're studying. Now, it's not just taking one note after another. It's not just this, and so on forever. If you're only doing that, it's a waste of time, actually. You're not doing what you need to do. In some ways, this is very much what people do when they highlight. That is, they highlight one sentence, and they highlight another, and they highlight this name, and they just highlight one thing after another. But they haven't done any of the key intellectual work. What does an outline mean? Or how does an outline differ from this?
That's different. Like specific points.
Right. And the specific points are different. I mean, these are specific points, right? But how is the outline different? There's a structure or an order to it, right, precisely. Because basically what you're doing is you identify in an outline, okay, these are the three major sections of the chapter, the three major subjects that are discussed here. And then this one is broken down into these 2 points. And this one has these 3 points. This one has these 2 points. And then, this one actually has those 2, and this has those 4, whatever. What you're doing is you're identifying the relationship of the ideas to each other. And you're grasping the structure or the organization of the argument or the description or whatever it is that you're reading. And that actually gives you, that fact itself, recognizing the relationship of the ideas to each other, is a really key element in the understanding. If all you have is one idea after another, you don't really understand what's being said. You have these loosely connected, isolated points, but you don't know what the point of the author is, the intention of the author, what it is that he's trying to say. Because for that, the relationship of the ideas to each other is really fundamental. I mean, again, another analogy, it's kind of a hokey analogy, but it's just one I experienced myself. I was sitting on a bus in the Milwaukee transit system this years ago when I took the bus, and I was looking up at the advertisements they had over the seats on the other side, and there were a bunch of books there. And I guess I must have been kind of up close, because what I was focusing on was the particular books. One might be Jane Austen, and the other might be, I don't know, Silas Marner, or another might have been a calculus textbook. I've forgotten what the specific books were, but there were a lot of individual books. But all of a sudden, I noticed that the way the books were organized was actually this way. And a book here, a book here, 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 book here. And then there was a book here. I'm not going to put the whole thing out, but it turns out that if you actually looked at the books spelled out, read. It was, I think, probably a library public service announcement or something like that. You could have memorized every single book title in that picture and come away entirely missing the whole point if you don't see that it was the way the books fit together and what they spelled out that actually was the main point. A lot of people do that when they just read one thing after another. They come away knowing some of the isolated things, but they don't really know what the meaning of the thing is because they haven't grasped the order or the structure. So that's why outlining is so key. Basically, and now there are all kinds of ways to do the outlining, and whether you use Roman numeral 1 and big letter A, I mean all those things. Sometimes people get hung up on that. I don't know why. That's pretty much irrelevant. The point is that you're identifying the relationship of the ideas to each other. You say there are 3 big ideas in this piece of reading, and on this idea he explains that by doing this point and this point. Or whatever. So that's going to be the grunt work, because outlining is not easy. I mean, it's time-consuming and sometimes very laborious to do, and yet I think it is absolutely essential to really grasping what the author is saying. Now, as you do this, you're actually really kind of burying yourself in the parts, in the details, of all the different things. You're attending to the order of them, but you're really down into the trenches, into the really knowing, what each part says, because you have to understand each part. I mean, you're not going to understand that this is the second major idea unless you're really kind of focusing on, okay, what's the argument being made here. And so most of the time, this is going to be the largest chunk of time that you devote in the process of study. Just because reading the thing relatively carefully, really identifying the ideas and where they stand is going to take time. And then even just things like jotting down notes. Obviously, you don't write everything out in great detail. You jot down notes in an outline. But that's still somewhat time-consuming, and it's really something that requires a certain amount of fortitude or perseverance. Sometimes, of course, you'll be reading something that you just really love, and time will fly by. But of course, lots of times, you're reading stuff that's useful or interesting, but it's still, it still really requires an effort to push your way through it. Now, that's the second step. There's a third step as well. And the striking thing about the third step is that it doesn't take anywhere near as much time as the second step, this movement back to the general. It's actually, in terms of the time devoted, relatively limited. And yet the payoff in terms of remembering material, assimilating it, is enormous. That is, if you're going to assimilate material, it's probably because you've done this third step really well. So what is the third step? Well, you've gotten the first time round kind of a general idea of what the whole thing is. You've kind of pushed through and read all the different parts, and you know what the different parts say. Then you really get down into the details, and you outline carefully and try to grasp the organization and structure in the second part. But precisely because you're so focused on this point after another, you need to step back and put things back into the general context. You have to move back to an understanding of the whole. And how do we do that? I suppose there are multiple ways, but in my opinion, the thing that's worked best for me is self-testing. Now, what do I mean by that? Okay, let's say you have a Friday quiz in your choose your class, sociology class, and you have to read a chapter of the sociology textbook for the week. Okay, so maybe on Sunday night you start with your first reading of the chapter. That is, you just push on through, read the chapter quickly. Okay, maybe on Monday or Tuesday you actually do the grunt work. You sit down and you read the chapter carefully. You outline it you really grasp the organizational structure of it, and really spend that time understanding the chapter. Then you put it aside for at least 24 hours. And then you come back, and the first thing you do is you grab a blank sheet of paper. And on that blank sheet of paper, you write an outline of the chapter. And as you've already done the outline, right? You did that in stage 2 with the notes that you took, the outline that you did. So you take the blank piece of paper, and you're going to write down what the outline is. Now, what's typically going to happen when you take that blank piece of paper and you write the outline? Well, if you've done your work pretty well, chances are pretty good you're going to remember, okay, there were 3 major sections in that chapter, 3 major ideas or points that were discussed. You might remember, maybe a couple of points on the first point. The second point, maybe that's vague. Maybe there were 2 or 3 points, but you can only remember B kind of vaguely, and you remember C, but you can't figure out what A was. On 3, maybe you remember A, but you don't really remember what B and C were. That is, you're going to come up with an outline that has gaps. You're not likely to remember all the details of the outline. Partly that's because you were so kind of embedded in the thing, going one by one by one, that it's just difficult to memorize a lot of different points. I mean, just to simply do that work. But if you have 3 sections, each of them has 3 subsections, each of them has 3 subsections, well, at some point it's just going to be a challenge, to remember it all. There are some people who have photographic memories, God bless them, but most of us don't. So we're not going to remember that. Okay, so we have this blank piece of paper. We've filled in what we can, what we remember from the outline. At that point, we then go back to the outline that we did. Oh, gosh, yeah, that was the 3rd point there. Oh, yeah, what he meant by B was this, and this is what A was, and this is what B and C were here. That is, we're going to actually identify the things that we forgot. Now, there's a certain paradox or irony here, which is that going forward from this point, very often the things you remember best in the outline are the things you forgot when you actually put it down in the outline the first time. Because the very fact that you forgot and you have to look it up highlights it. The example I think of in my own life is I was very good in spelling in grade school. And I still remember in 6th grade misspelling the word privilege. I will never in my life misspell the word privilege, because that's the one I got wrong on a 6th grade spelling test. I had no idea what the other 9 or 19 words were. But privilege, I will always remember. I put a D in it, just what didn't belong there, right? So, but the very fact of missing it kind of locked it in my memory. So whatever it is that you didn't remember the first time, for whatever reason you didn't remember it, when you go back and you self-test, that actually kind of locks it into place better. And so you're less likely to have that gap again in the future. Okay, so you've self-tested, you've filled in the gaps by comparing it to your outline. Then you put it aside again. Maybe if you did this Wednesday night, you go back on Thursday night. Same thing. Blank piece of paper. Do the outline. This time, you'll be impressed, with how well you remember most of these ideas. Because you've now had the one general reading, you've now had the real grunt work of the outline, you've gone back and you've looked at the overall structure again quickly once, the first self-test. You're doing it again, and that kind of locks it in place again. By this time, you really are capable of answering the question, what was that thing you read last night? You read the sociology chapter on, I don't know, what's in a sociology chapter? Kinship relationships in primitive societies. Maybe that's the chapter you read this week. If somebody says, well, what did you read? You actually have an answer. I mean, you can actually give a really good answer. And if you remember this anecdote I told you back in the spring, but it's an anecdote that really played a central part in my own intellectual life. And it's the source of actually this whole interest in study skills. I was a freshman at Notre Dame, and I was doing very well. When would it have been? I think I had a 4.0 for semester, 3.8 the second semester. Darn calc. Didn't have any intermediate grades at the time, so I got the B there. And so I'm kind of cruising along sophomore year, doing really well. And then I knew a guy who was a philosophy student. He was a graduate student getting an MA there. He was actually the son of the president of Venezuela. Very interesting guy named Rafael Caldera. Very, very smart guy. And so one day I asked him, well, do you have any study tips, Rafa? And he kind of stopped and said, well, do you really want to know? I was kind of taken aback. Oh, of course, I asked you, He says, okay, well, let's meet in the student center next week. I'm thinking, this is strange. What's he getting at here? I just was kind of looking for a few study tips, So we, set up an appointment, and the following week we went to La Fortune Student Center and we sat down. And he started out by asking me about the courses I had taken that previous semester. And so I started talking very enthusiastically about the courses, because I was so lucky. I had such great courses, such great teachers. I was really having a ball going to college. And so I told him I was taking this course, and we read this book, and that book was just great. And I took this course, and I read this book, and that was really wonderful. And he says, okay, let's say take that book. What did that book say? Tell me about that book. So I gave him a vague, one-paragraph description of the book. A good, accurate one-paragraph description of the book. And then he started probing. As he started he tried to get me to elaborate, to get beyond that kind of general paragraph description of the book. And very quickly, it became apparent that I didn't remember very much about the details of the book. I remember I liked it. I had a vague general idea of what it was about, what the basic thesis was. But, when pushed, I just didn't remember that much about the particular details of what the argument of the book was. And what he had done was to kind of alert me to the fact, or help me to see, that I had done a very good job of studying to the test. A very good job of getting an A in the course. But I had not studied in such a way as to assimilate it, to really make it part of me, so that it would always be part of me in the future. It had just kind of gone off into the ether. I could take the book off the shelf and remember what it had said, but it was there on the shelf. It wasn't in me. And so it was interesting. The first thing he had me do is I was taking 6 courses. I was going to take 6 courses the following semester. He told me, don't take 6, take 4. And we kind of went through some of this stuff about the importance of outlining and how much time that takes. And he said, much better to do 4 courses well than to do 6 courses in a mediocre way. It's actually, he invoked an old Latin saying or phrase. Boy, these are really terrible. Maybe the green one's a little bit better. Non multa, sed multum. Not many things, but well. That is, it's not quantity that counts. Quality is key. So if you do 4 courses, but do them really well, that's much better than doing 6 courses and doing it in a mediocre way. And even if you get A's in the 6 courses, that is, the short-term payoff is good. The long-term, you're going to lose. And most importantly, you're not going to have developed your intellectual capacities, your intellectual abilities. Because remember, there's 2 things going on here when you study. You want to actually learn about the particulars of the book that you're studying, the course that you're studying. But in all of this, you're also trying to develop your skills. You're trying to hone your mind. Your mind is a tool. And you want to make that a more effective tool. You learn how to learn. And the secret is that you can't learn how to learn except by doing it the right way. There's this old great phrase of Vince Lombardi. You know what he said in response to people who said that practice makes perfect? His response was, perfect practice makes perfect. It's not just the practice, it's practicing well. Doing it the right way in practice is what makes it perfect. The same thing is true of us intellectually. It's not just doing some intellectual work, reading or whatever. It's doing it well that really kind of ingrains habits in us and gives us new skills and capacities that make our intellect a better tool for learning. But we've got to do it well in order to do that. So then, now on the 3rd step here, I mentioned self-testing. In a way, we're talking here about what we might do over the course of a week when we're reading 1 chapter of a textbook. If you step back, we also have to do the same thing with respect to the whole semester. So for example, if you have a midterm, what you're doing is you're stepping back and you're looking at the whole first half of the course. And what you do is you go back and you look over your notes. And then again, you have another kind of self-testing. That is, you look over your notes and then again, blank piece of paper, you outline the first half of the course. That is, you have a sense for how the course was organized. And this doesn't always work because some teachers are better teachers than others. But in general, if you have a good teacher, the teacher organizes the course in a certain way in order to reach a certain result. So the way the teacher organized the course is going to tell you something about what his understanding of the subject is, what he's getting at, what he wants you to get at. And so, there's some teachers, this is really bizarre in my opinion, who, spend a lot of time talking about things in class in a kind of unorganized way, and then they give a test, and the test is basically on the reading you did in the book. Well, that's not a bad thing. Actually, testing for the book reading is fine. But why would you waste all that time in class, the time you actually have with the students yourself? Why'd you waste all that, kind of talk about things in a disorganized way, not test on them? It's almost like the teacher would not be taking himself seriously. As a teacher, I want my students to read the books that I assign because that's the background they need to understand the subject. And especially, it's the background that they need to understand me. That's what I'm there for. I'm a teacher. I'm excited about my material. I'm teaching constitutional law. I love constitutional law. I want people to understand constitutional law. So I'm going to especially use my class time to get across the stuff that I think is really important. The big picture. How has constitutional law evolved over time? You know, it started here, but here it took it went around a bend and took a different approach. And it ended up here, which is very different from where it started out. I mean, that big picture is what, you know, I find really interesting. I think if you want to really understand constitutional law, you have to see how it's developed over time, where we were, what we went through, and how we got to where we are now. Now, you know, some people write books about that, and maybe you can assign a book about that, which is fine, especially if you don't know con law. But if you really know con law, you got things to say, and you want to tell people what those things are, and that's what you use your class time for. And so, especially if it's a good teacher, assume that what the teacher is doing in class is the thing that he considers the most important. You know, that's why he's spending the class time on it. You know, and especially if he's a teacher who seems like he knows what he's talking about and really loves his material. You know, that's a great sign that this is the stuff you really have to focus on. And of course, you need to do the reading, because lots of times, certainly in my classes, if you haven't done the reading, you're going to have a tough time following my argument in the class. Because, you know, I'm going to be talking about how things have changed over time in a given area. How has executive power changed in the course of U.S. history? Well, I'm going to be talking about that, but they have to have read the cases in order to know what I'm talking about. So the midterm, you know, in a way, the teacher who gives you tests is doing you a favor. Because what he's doing is he's doing another part of this testing process. So in the midterm, you go back and you study the whole first half of the semester. For the final, especially if the final is cumulative, and a good teacher ought to make it cumulative, you know, then you have to go back and look at the whole course. You know, sometimes, you know, at Notre Dame there was a rule that when you gave a final exam, you could exempt a second semester senior if he had at least a B in the course. And of course, students loved teachers who exempted them from the final. They'd much rather go out and party than study for a final, right? But the teachers who did that weren't doing them a favor. They were depriving them of something really important. That is, they were depriving them of this testing stage where they could really step back, look at the whole course, you know, get the big picture again, and carry out of the course a much deeper knowledge of what it was that they'd been studying in a way that made them much more likely to remember it, you know, a year or 4 years or 10 years later, you know, which is the ideal. I mean, you know, some people really think of college as a hoop you have to jump through in order to get a degree, in order to get a job. You know, that is, it's simply a kind of means to an end. And the actual means itself isn't all that important. I mean, what a crazy way to live college. Study all this stuff just to remember it for a bunch of tests and then forget it all. I mean, that's nuts. You know, you're spending all that time working. You might as well remember it, right? You might as well become an educated person. So that's the way I describe the overall process of studying. And you can take this and basically apply it to other areas as well. I've been talking about reading. Another area would be notes, you know, note-taking from your classes. Again, I think good teachers don't just kind of go through the reading they assign. How boring is that? He told me to read a chapter and then he kind of come into class and he just tells me what I read. Wow, just terminally boring. Why bother to go to class? You know, ideally, a good teacher assigns you reading that gives you the background, and then he comes into class and gives you more and kind of puts it all together. Well, if that's what's happening, then in a way, the notes that you take on the course are almost like the outline of another book. It's your teacher's book, but instead of writing it out, he dictated it to you, you know, in all those notes that you took throughout the semester. And so again, if that's the case, if those notes are kind of like the teacher's book, and if you want to remember that, well, that involves these steps again, right? In a way, the first one time through, I guess, is, well, in some ways the first two steps are combined. because you're hearing it for the first time, but then you're also working on the outline as you take the notes, right? Whereas when you take notes, again, it's not just one thing after another. You're trying to identify, well, okay, this was a major idea, and then these were sub-ideas, and here's another major idea, and these are the sub-ideas, and so forth. So you're kind of grasping the outline as you go through the course. And of course, at some point in the outline, you may say, why is he talking about that? He was talking about that a minute ago. Now he's talking about this. How did he get from here to there? And you have no idea. Maybe you just missed something. Maybe he garbled something. Or maybe you were distracted. Or maybe you just made a point you didn't understand. So what do? Well, you do one of two things. You check with somebody else, another good student in the class, and you ask, well, he was talking about this, and all of a sudden he was talking about that. How did he get from there to there? What was the kind of logical kind of development there? And maybe another student's, a friend of yours in the class could kind of fill in that blank, just as you could fill in some blanks for him or her. But in addition, maybe he says, I don't know how he got there. The obvious thing to do is you go to the teacher. You say, listen, I'm sorry, I don't understand. In this part of the class you were talking about A and then B, and then all of a sudden you talked about C, and I didn't see how C kind of fit in with the rest of the things you were talking about. And most teachers, maybe there are some lazy teachers who are just would regard that as a bit of a pain. Most teachers, I think, are actually excited that a student actually wants to understand what they're saying, and the result is, I think most teachers, if you go to them and ask, will give you an answer, and actually they'll be pleased that you asked the question, because they want to convey what it is that they're talking about. So you make sure that you kind of fill in the blanks in the outline, and then you go through the same kind of self-testing process again. So every week, perhaps, you set aside some time where you review your notes in the week for the class. Maybe that's something you do, I don't know, on Saturday morning or something, that you set, or Friday afternoon or Friday, whatever. Some particular point of time where you can kind of step back and look at the week and how the lectures unfolded during the week. And again, one way you can start is by just taking a blank piece of paper. What was the outline of the things that were discussed in class that week? Oh, you remember this, or remember that? Oh, I completely forgot that, And then, do that a couple of times, self-test, and, again, as with reading, you're likely to remember a whole lot more than you might otherwise remember. So, now, at this point, you've done a lot of work. You've done, basically what a good student should do, but you're not finished yet. You might describe everything that we've done so far as an attempt to master the material. Somebody is communicating knowledge to you, and you want to grasp that. You want to latch onto it. You want to understand what's been told to you. But that's not the whole thing. That's a very, very important first step. And in some ways, maybe it's the biggest part of what you have to do. But there's a second step as well. The second step is to evaluate. That is, you can't go through life just hearing things from people and memorizing it, even assimilating it, and just leaving it at that. For one thing, what if you have two different teachers who might be both good teachers, and they teach you different things that are not fully compatible with each other? Maybe you have two political science teachers, and one says, separation of powers is the greatest thing since sliced bread. It's wonderful. It protects our liberty. Another person says, separation of powers is terrible. It creates stalemate. We never get anything done. Smart people can make arguments for different cases. So whether you've taken one course or two, there's always the potential for the fact that, well, what you've been taught may be an incomplete picture. So what that means is that even if you've mastered the material, you've really studied it, you kind of done all your, your outlining, your self-testing, you really know what the chapter said or what the teacher's lectures said, you have to start asking yourself some questions, evaluating the material. Now, some students will say, who am I to evaluate what my teacher is saying here? After all, the teacher has studied this a lot longer than I have. This is his job. This is what he does. How would I have the chutzpah, to say he's wrong about this or that, Well, it's certainly true that when you do this, you have to do it with a certain humility. But the ultimate answer to the question, who am I to do this, is you are a human being with reason. And you have to exercise your own reason. And that means it's important to evaluate. So for example, one thing you ask, is all the material that I've been presented with in this book or in these lectures, is it all internally consistent? One possibility might be, well, gee, he said, it says one thing here, it says another thing there. They don't really seem to fit together so well. How is it, that you can say both these things when they look contradictory? And that means you've got to think through it. You have to ask other people their opinions. You might ask the teacher, how is it that this is, not contradictory? That's one thing, the internal consistency. Are the arguments persuasive? The teacher says A, B, C, and therefore it follows that D. And you say, well, I can see A, and I can see B, and I can see C, but how does D come out of that? Has the argument been persuasive? Has he really made a compelling case? Or has he just left out some steps in the reasoning? Maybe you have to, again, go to the teacher, say, listen, you said this and this and that, and then you said the result should be I should accept this. But I don't see how this flows from that. It doesn't seem to me to be really connected with it. And, get them to make an argument. Or you can ask other people too, maybe other teachers, read other books. Are there obviously unanswered questions? He said this and this and this and that, but there's an obvious question out there, and he never said anything about it. So, why not? What would he say in answer to that question? Actually, it's always a good thing to do when you're studying this to say, let's say you just read a chapter in political science on separation of powers. It's good to imagine, okay, this author really likes separation of powers. What would somebody have said if she didn't like separation of powers? What would be a kind of contrary perspective on this? Sometimes you might even Google it, hates separation of powers, and get something that gives a different perspective on separation of powers. Over time, you're building up knowledge. You've built up some knowledge in high school. A lot of high school is really actually just building up a lot of raw knowledge, reading literature, reading history, reading lots of different things. And you're slowly, especially if you're doing it well, you're building up a store of knowledge. That store of knowledge that you've built up until today, that gives you something that you're going to use to measure what you hear in other classes, what you read in other books. I came to an understanding of this. This book is saying something that's really different. Why? What accounts for the differences between the two things? What would I have to know to really decide which view is accurate? And this is where you kind of push yourself. It's, sometimes it might be doing extra reading. It might be, going to an encyclopedia online and looking for different perspectives on a particular phenomenon. One person has this theory, of this particular book. But another person says, no, 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 the book means something quite different. You know, you read a novel and you think that it portrays one character very attractively, and then your teacher basically says, the author is using this person as an example of somebody who's really not very sharp, who's not really smart, not really good. And you say, boy, I thought he looked pretty good. I mean, I had this experience once. I was playing basketball, pickup basketball with a guy who's actually a priest now, very, very sharp guy. We were trading notes on a wonderful piece of literature. It's a novel everybody should read, but especially young women. This has nothing to do with the class, but it's a kind of a brick of a book. Especially getting through the first 70 pages is kind of tough because it's talking about the layout of farms in 13th century Norway. 70 pages of how the farm is laid out in 13th century Norway. It's rough going. Then about page 70, Kristen gets born. From there on, it's 3 big volumes. It's huge. Kristen Lavransdatter. Basically, it's a 3-volume history of a woman who lived in about, actually, 14th century Norway. But point is, I was talking with this guy on the basketball court. We're just kind of sharing the fact we both really like Kristen Lavransdatter. Lavransdatter means daughter of Lavrans. Lavrans is the father. And I made a comment about the fact that, Lavrans was a very attractive character. And it was interesting because the guy came back to me and he says, in some ways, I think Lavrans is really the source of the whole problem for Kristen. He's not, in fact, attractive. He is the source of her problems. And thinking about it, I was convinced that he was right. That while Lavrans had a variety of attractive characteristics, he did certain things that really were very harmful to Kristen. And maybe that's in itself interesting, isn't it? That attractive people can do things that are very harmful to others. At any rate, that's an example where, not everybody reads, a novel the same way, views a character the same way, views an institution or a political principle the same way. There are lots of interesting questions to raise. And while we'd have to do it with some humility, we have to push ourselves to do it. We can't just sit back and memorize whatever the teacher says and assume that that's the last word. I mean, it's good that we learn what the teacher says, but then we have to pull back a little bit and ask ourselves, is this really consistent with what I know from other things that I've studied, from other experiences that I've had? What are there other perspectives on this? Now a good teacher will not teach you that separation of powers is good without telling you why some people say that separation of powers is bad. Part of even if he wants to persuade you that separation of powers is good, an important part of his pedagogy, of his teaching, would be to let you know what the other side is and give it a very fair statement and then explain why he thinks that's wrong. Why? If the teacher doesn't do that, then he's in some way setting himself up for failure. Because he's convinced you that separation of powers is good, but you're going to walk out of class and next year you're going to hear somebody attack separation of powers. And you're never going to have heard that argument. And so maybe you're going to be persuaded, oh, separation of powers isn't good after all. Whereas if your teacher was trying to actually educate you and persuade you, he would have told you what the arguments on the other side were and kind of prepared you to hear what those other arguments were, and then what he thinks the right answer to the arguments are. So sometimes your teacher, if he's a good teacher, will tell you, what the different perspectives are. That's an important part of teaching, I think. But if the teacher doesn't, maybe you're going to have to go out and find that on your own. Google it, go to an encyclopedia, find out what different perspectives are. Now, that's a summary of Study Skills 1. And just a couple of points to finish up quickly, and we'll go to the break. Well, actually, no, we're not going to finish up quickly. We're going to go to the break. It's already too late for the break. What is the typical student reaction to my description of study that I've given you? The general reaction is, are you kidding? You are out of your mind. You want me to do this with all the stuff that I'm studying? It would take forever. I would never get to do anything else in life except study, study, study. Life would be so boring. I understand that reaction. And the rest of the class today is trying to persuade you that that isn't what happens necessarily if you take my advice to study this way. First of all, it probably isn't possible for you to study everything that you study this way. Obviously it partly depends on how many classes you have, how difficult are those classes. Let's say you're a freshman in college and you're taking 5 classes. Let's say that there are 5 really, really challenging classes. Well, that's a different world from taking 5 gut courses. Do they still call them gut courses? I don't know. 5 really simple classes. The priest who teaches Irish history to the Notre Dame football players. Things like that. More likely for a lot of us, it's 5 classes. 2 of them are pretty tough. 2 of them are kind of medium. 1's pretty easy, or something like that. It may vary. But what I would say is this. It may not be possible for you to study this way in all your classes, as you may have to take shortcuts and do less than the ideal in some of your classes. But what I'd say is avoid this. Avoid doing a mediocre job of study in all your classes. At least take some of your classes and go the whole way. Maybe it's going to be a couple of classes you particularly like, or a couple of classes where the teacher is particularly good, or maybe it's 2 classes in your major, or whatever, what field of study that you especially want to concentrate on is. But whatever the reason, however you make the choice, take a couple of classes and really study very well. Why? Let me give you an analogy. Let's say you want to get in shape. You're tired of being flabby and weak and out of shape. You're going to get in shape. Okay? So let's say you resolve that you're going to bench press 50 pounds for 10 rotations 5 times a week. And you're going to run a mile twice a week and do it in 7 minutes. Okay, so you trudge over to the weight room and you trudge out onto the track and you do it. The first week, you do your 50-pound bench presses, 10 rotations, 5 times a week. You do your 7-minute while twice a week, and that's off to a good start. The second week, you do the same thing. It's easier to do the bench presses. It's a little bit easier to run the 7-minute mile, and you stick with it. The third week, the fourth week, the fifth week, you keep doing the same things. 50 pounds bench press, 7-minute miles. Now, it's getting easier to do that, but you keep doing the same thing. are you going to get into really good shape if you simply keep doing the thing you were able to do the first week? No. You're going to have to bump that 50 pounds up to 60 pounds or 70 or 80. You're going to have to do that mile in 6 minutes and 45 seconds or 6 minutes and 30 seconds or 6 minutes, whatever. That is, your goal is to actually expand your capacity, to be able to do more, to build up your muscle strength, to build up your stamina. But you can only do that by expanding what you're doing over time. The problem with studying in a mediocre way is that if you start that way and keep doing it that way, you're going to end up with mediocre intellectual abilities. You're not going to have expanded your capacity. Some people think that intellectual capacity is something you're born with. You just have, this much intellectual capacity. That's the way you were born, that's where you're going to live, and that's where you're going to die. Well, there's just a lot of evidence that that's not the case. That in fact, there's a range. There's limits to what we can do. For reasons that I would bet are physiological, although I couldn't actually prove that, I will never be a mathematical genius. I'm competent at math, but there are some people that have just an extraordinary gift of math, and I don't think I could study math forever and not have that kind of gift. But I could grow, significantly. So there may be ranges, that are set in our intellectual ability. Maybe, our genes do, limit us in certain ways and also give us, certain advantages. But nothing is static. It's not like you're just pegged at this level of intelligence. In fact, by studying well, we can expand our intelligence. That is our capacity to learn, our capacity to understand. And so, even if you can't study really, really well in all your courses, pick at least some of your courses and really go all the way. Really do a really, really good job of studying so that when you come out, you can kind of say, I really know this stuff. I really put myself into it. Because by doing that, it's like, upping the bench pressing or upping the stamina with the running. By doing that, you're actually expanding your capacity. You're making your intellect a sharper tool, more capable of learning things. It may be a challenge to do this for reasons that have to do with social psychology. Everybody, human beings have what some people call a bias toward the normal. That we have a tendency to kind of look at life the way kind of everybody around us looks at life. What we consider in our given circumstances the normal. Now, in fact, ideas of what is normal vary quite a bit from country to country and culture to culture and from one age to another age. The normal is constantly shifting. But the point is that there's often many good things in the normal, but there's some not so good things too. Take an example of a good thing in the normal. Is it wrong to murder another human being in order to expand your financial security? What do you think? No. Okay. I don't have time to show this, but my guess is that we could have a 15 or 20 minute discussion, and I could give you a really hard time trying to show why that is so. Why is murder wrong? Well, some people say, well, it's wrong because God said it was wrong. Well, who's God? Your God? I can play all kinds of intellectual games and kind of, resist your arguments, or especially if it's, based on reason. it's easy to play the skeptic, you know. And in fact, I actually used to do this. My wife picked up on this, actually, because I actually had a class taped at the first place I taught. I taught in a small college in the middle of Massachusetts back in the mid-'70s. And I taught a class, and I would challenge the students to make an argument about why murder was wrong. And, you know, they were all convinced the murder was wrong. But when they tried to give arguments, they actually weren't very articulate. My wife was the one who picked up from watching the tape that I'd get this little smile on my face when, you know, like when they were making an argument like, I know where you're going and I'm going to zap you, and resist, you know, what the argument was. It was embarrassing to have that pointed out. But the fact of the matter is, it's not easy to make an argument for why murder is wrong. Because ultimately, in order to do that, to make an argument, you have to really establish the foundations for why anything is wrong. You know, you have to give an argument for the very foundations of morality. Well, I mean, philosophers have argued about that for centuries. There are all kinds of positions on that. And it's not easy to make an argument on really fundamental moral issues. Nonetheless, most of us think that murder is wrong. And thank God. You know, because we woke up every morning saying, I wonder if I should murder somebody today. That would not be a society I would want to live in. I want to live in a society where people never even think about whether murder makes sense. It's ridiculous. It's awful. It's evil. You don't do that. That's wonderful. I love that kind of normalcy. Taking for granted certain fundamental things. The problem is, you can't have everybody do that all the time. Because if everybody in society just says, well, we don't do murder, that's just not done, what happens when somebody comes along and says, some kind of murders are great? For example, killing Jews is wonderful, because Jews are so evil. They're the source of all evil in society. Well, of course, if we've never actually had to make an argument for murder, when we're confronted with a Nazi, we may not be very articulate in responding to him. And the result may be that the Nazis may actually win elections and take control. That would be very unfortunate, right? In some ways, I think that's what's going on in our society right now about marriage. You know, for a long time, it was just assumed that, you know, a man marries a woman and they have children, and they raise a family, and then they have children, and that's the way society goes on. And that was just kind of the normal thing. But now there are a lot of people who are challenging that idea of marriage. They're saying, no, that, you know, marriage is really something quite different. For one thing, it doesn't have to do with kids. You know, that's just a kind of an optional extra in marriage. And doesn't actually have to be, you know, a man and a woman. It could be two men or two women. And for that matter, you know, why can't it be 3 or 4 or 5 men or women? You know, why does it have to be just 2? You know, in some ways, that we're being challenged now to articulate what marriage is, which didn't have to be done before. And now we have to kind of think through it and figure out what marriage really is. So the bias for the normal is actually a very valuable thing in some ways, but at some point, you can't just assume that just because something normal it's right. Now, why do I go through all of this? What is it? Why am I making this argument? You're going to go off to college pretty soon, and I have no way of knowing for sure what the atmosphere is going to be like that you find yourself in. You know, maybe you will find yourself in the midst of a whole bunch of people who become your friends, who work their tails off, who really work really hard. They look at this and they say, yeah, I love it. This is the way I want to do it. And being with those people, you'll be encouraged to study that way. It's also possible you may have to go off to school, And you may be with a bunch of people who are really nice people who basically do very little study at all. You know, if you actually Google how much do college students study, they actually can, you'll have a couple of things pop up that are unbelievable. I mean, just astounding. You know, where, I mean, for example, a couple of studies suggest that the average class plus study per day of a typical college student is somewhere around 3.5 to 4 hours. Total, class and study. So in your whole week, you know, you're going to end up doing somewhere around 25 to 28 hours of class and study. That is, if this is accurate, the typical college student is a goof-off. That is, the typical college student is spending at least as much time playing video games, watching lousy TV, fooling around with Facebook, and a bunch of other things that have nothing to do with study. Now, if you find yourself in that situation, it isn't necessarily going to be easy to really challenge yourself. It's possible. And if you're motivated, you can do it. But when you're on your own, it's not easy to be the one person who is living up to higher standards when everybody around you is living down to lower standards and seems to be getting along okay. They may not be your valedictorians and your A students, but I mean, they're doing okay. They're getting Bs because a lot of college teachers, in their own way, are goof-offs in the sense that they don't really demand of their students because they're afraid if they have too many low grades, they'll lose enrollments and the department chair will get mad at them. Which is one reason why you have grade inflation in American society. You know, so, you know, they may get along okay in the short term. The problem is that very often it's a question of short-term gratification versus long-term gratification, long-term benefits. And if you really want to develop yourself intellectually, you really have to challenge yourself, probably to do more than most of the people around you are doing. There may be an exception. If you get into a pre-med program, you know, you may find people around you really working hard, and that's great. That'll really be an incentive to you to work hard as well. Because typically people in pre-med are, you know, for the most part, they know they're going to have to really, really work hard to succeed, to get into med school. You know, so there's some programs where you'll find that. Maybe it's a particular college or just a particular group of kids you hang out with. In fact, in some ways, you might even want to think about that as you make friends in college. As you might actually want to consciously make friends with people that you think aren't slackers, you know, goof-offs. You might want to actually kind of include as one of your criteria for friendship that people have a certain kind of desire to be excellent. You know, a certain aspiration, not necessarily just to get good grades, but actually, you know, want to be good people. And that's really, having friends like that is really valuable because it's easier for you to have those standards if the people you hang out with have those standards. But it can be a challenge. And unfortunately, what I've described is, I think, fairly atypical of a college student. Not too many students would do the kinds of things I'm describing. And yet, I think the ones who do are typically going to be the ones who are the most successful at learning, coming to a articulate understanding of the things that they're studying. So that's a factor to consider, this whole question of the framework of the normal and the people that you associate with, and whether it means resisting their lower standards or seeking out people who have higher standards. Now, okay, with about 25 minutes left, we now get to study skills 2. There's I've been talking about how to study. I want to step back a little bit now and talk about a certain kind of framework within which you can do that kind of study. Some of the things will be very modest and very almost minimal. Other things will be moving generally toward bigger and bigger questions. So one thing I haven't mentioned yet is when you study, I've talked about the what of study. What about the where and when? That's not the most important thing, but it's something that has some importance. Places cue us. That is, we find that if we do certain things habitually in a certain place and at a certain time, it comes easier to us to do those things in that place and time. So for example, if you typically walk into your living room, flop down on the couch, and watch the TV, and you do that most of the time when you're in the living room, then when you go into the living room and flop down on the couch, opening up a book and studying is not going to be as easy. Because places cue us. We tend to start identifying places with the activities that we habitually do in them. So if we go to our bedroom or a study room and sit down at a desk with a chair that gives us some good posture, and if that's where we typically study, then the fact that we're human beings that create habits, that when we do the same thing in the same way, it develops a certain ease or facility, an inclination that helps us to do that. I mean, step back for a minute and talk about habituation. What is habituation? Habituation is just the simple fact that when we do something over and over again, it's easier to do. You know, start with something physical. You want to play tennis, okay? If you want to learn to be a good tennis player, what do? You got to develop certain strokes, right? You got to learn how to do a forehand. You got to step forward, slightly toward the ball, keep the racket parallel to the ground, meet the ball off your front foot, and follow through. Swing, backhand, again, front foot slightly forward, hit it just in front of that, follow through, slightly over to give a little bit of topspin. How do you do that? How do you learn to hit strokes that way? There is only one way, right? What is that? You just do it over and over again. Hit the ball the right way. Perfect practice makes perfect, right? If you hit it the wrong way, that's just getting bad habits, right? You got to hit it the right way. Okay, that's a habit. That's a physical habit. And we know from our experience that if you do something like that over and over again, you develop the habit. So when you're standing there waiting for the ball to come over the net, you know, at the beginning you have to think to yourself, oh, I got to turn, I got to step forward, hit the ball off my front foot. But once you've done it many, many times, you don't even think about it. You just turn and hit it, and you hit it the right way, right? Why should we assume that that's only true of physical activities? Why wouldn't it also be true of moral and mental activities? And I think the fact of the matter is when you do something over and over again, you develop a habit. That could be true of physical things. It could also be true of, let's take a moral example. Let's say that when something goes wrong, you just habitually blow up. As you get angry, you shout some obscenities, and you get over it eventually, okay? If you do that over and over again, then your natural reaction when something goes wrong is to blow up, shout some obscenities, right? If, on the contrary, when you feel an inclination to get angry, what you do is you stop and you exert control of your reason over your passion, your emotion, and you act calmly. At the beginning, if you have a temperament that's choleric, you know, where you get angry easily, then at the beginning it'll be very, very tough. But over time, you'll develop a greater ease. It'll be easier to control your temper if you just do it over and over again. Well, the same thing is true with some aspects of mental life as well. If you identify a place where you study, you have appropriate posture, appropriate lighting, enough room to spread out and have your books, your notes, whatever. That is, if you set up your little world, then once you enter that world, it's easier to get into it right away, instead of having to kind of work to get into study mode. And so, now obviously you can't be the kind of person, you don't want to be the kind of person who can only study at your favorite desk in your bedroom. Because sometimes you got to study somewhere else too, right? But insofar as you can control your physical circumstances, trying to identify a regular place of study that's comfortable without being too comfortable, because if it's too comfortable, that doesn't really help study, right? It helps, as opposed to study. So something that, facilitates study, and then develop that habit, that's really valuable. That's place. Second is time. Human beings are different. The classic example is morning people and night people. I don't know what you'll find in your life. My experience is that morning people marry night people, and night people marry morning people. I don't know what there is. Human beings you're always looking for somebody who's like you, but also looking for somebody who's different from you. And when it comes to night people and morning people, it seems like most of the time you end up marrying somebody different from you. If you're the morning person, you marry a night person, or vice versa. There are exceptions, but it happens a lot anyway, from what I can tell. So I cannot give you some specific direction saying it's always best to study at these times. Because, let's say studying in the morning may be something that's great for some people, whereas it's much better for other people to study in the afternoon or in the evening or at night. I have a son who spent a large part of his high school and college doing most of his serious reading, I think between 12 a.m. and 4 a.m. He was a night person. He loved to work at night. He got his mother's gene on that one, not his father's gene. Now, in general, I think there are some reasons not to prefer having that gene. But for him, it worked. He spent all those night hours reading the great literature of the Western world and got himself a great education. You have to be able to identify when the best time for you to do certain things is. When is the best time for you to study? When are you most alert? When are you capable of engaging in sustained activities? When do you need to take a break to do exercise or something different? It's going to vary from person to person, but you've got to know yourself and respond to it. Now, there's a footnote here that is a constraint on this. The constraint is this, that the world has its own typical way of doing things, and if it doesn't actually conform to the way you do things, that can lead to some heartburn. So, for example, my son loves to study between 12 a.m. and 4 a.m. Most of the world doesn't operate on that schedule, which means that can be a problem. If you have to be up at 7 a.m. or 8 a.m. because your job requires you to work between 8 and 12 in the morning, then you probably don't want to be studying at 3 or 4 at night, because you need more sleep than that, unless you're one of those weird people who can get by on 3 hours of sleep. I've known a few people like that, but most of us need 7 or 8 hours of sleep. And so sometimes we have to act within constraints that are not of our own choosing, And I'll mention one of my pet peeves just in passing here. When I first began going to college, most students didn't like 8 o'clock classes. When I began teaching, or certainly by the time I'd been teaching a few years, most students didn't like 9 o'clock classes. Today, a lot of students don't like any morning classes. A lot of students like to stay up late and sleep in, and they like to schedule their classes either in the late morning or in the afternoon. Well, and if you take my son as an example, maybe that's not a bad idea. Maybe you can work that pretty well. And whenever I try to, over the years, my wife and I tried to get our kids to go to bed, they'd say, well, what does it matter, if I go to bed early? If I stay up late and do my work then, as long as I do my work, why does it matter when I do it? And it's not out of the question that they may be right. In a given set of circumstances, somebody may be able to pull that off. But there is this counterfactor which you might want to think about. I talked about habits before. Habits of when people do things. And I may be wrong about it, but I think in general, in our society, most people think of the day hours as time for work and the evening hours as time for play and relaxation. Not everybody thinks of it that way. My own experience is that the vast majority of people think that way. The work is usually something you do during the day, and at night there's usually more relaxation or leisure activities. What that means is that if you shift your day from, let's say, 7 in the morning to 11 at night, and you just kind of rotate that to 11 in the morning to 2 o'clock at night or something like that, I think what happens in most cases is that you may have the same length day, but the proportion of work hours declines and the proportion of leisure hours and relaxation activities expand. That is, the more you stay up late, the larger chunk of your day is devoted to leisure activities. The later you sleep in, the smaller the amount of time devoted to work activities. Now, there are always exceptions. I mean, these are not hard and fast rules. But as a general rule, I think that's accurate. And since, maybe this is changing. Maybe you will be working in a world where it's not a 9 to 5 job or 8 to 4 or 8 to 5 job. Maybe you'll be in a world where everybody's telecommuting and they just work 8 hours a day at some point, whenever they want to do it during the day. But I have my doubts about that. The idea of doing work during the daytime and relaxing at night is not something that I think is going to change quite that easily. And so the bottom line on that is I suggest, first of all, you have to look at yourself and see when you study best, when you do work best. But in general, other things being equal, if you can try to get up at a reasonably decent hour and go to bed at a reasonably decent hour, by which I mean, get up 7 o'clock, give or take an hour. Go to bed at 11 o'clock, give or take an hour. Obviously, different people are going to adjust that a bit. But if you can be, generally awake during the day and asleep at night, that probably will help, to facilitate studying and work, But know yourself is the ultimate norm, the thing you really have to attend to. And if you decide to have a less typical schedule, great, but make sure you use that time well. Now, as I said, one of the typical reactions to this is incredulity. You're kidding. How can we do all this work? And so I started to actually sit down and write down what kind of time we have typically during the week. How many hours in a week? 168. Okay. Now, let's say we're going to get 8 hours of sleep. Most college students don't. That's a terrible mistake, because what happens is they get 6 hours of sleep and then they work at 60% efficiency and actually get less done than they would get done if they just slept 8 hours and worked more efficiently. There really is, if you don't get the right amount of sleep, you really don't work as well. Just a lot of studies of that. And so, in general, it's a really good idea to get a good night's sleep. All-nighters is, I think, if you're doing an all-nighter, you may have to do it and it may work, but you went about it wrong to find yourself in that position. All-nighters are really stupid as a general rule. Even staying up until the wee hours studying is usually stupid, because you lose so much efficiency in your studying when you do that. Ideally, the night before a test, you should get 8 hours of sleep, the way you get an 8 hours of sleep every other night. Okay? So let's have 8 hours of sleep. So that's what? 56 hours, right? So we got 56 hours we're sleeping. Okay, so that means we're down to 112, okay? So we got to eat, right? How much time does it take to eat? Well, you can gobble things down quite a bit, but especially if you're eating with roommates, friends, whatever. What would it be reasonable to say? Half an hour for breakfast, half an hour for lunch, an hour for dinner? That's that's plenty, don't you think? Or 2 hours a day? I mean, that's actually pretty generous, I think. I mean, obviously, what I'm focusing on there is not just eating. Actually, I mean, that's a combination of eating and friendship in some ways too, right? So we'll come back to that later on. So let's say 2 hours a day times 7 is, we're down to 14. So that's the eating with some friendship as well. So we're down now to 98 hours. We do want to shower, do our friends a favor, and shower and groom, maybe half an hour in the morning, half an hour at night, So let's call it 7 hours, except that on the weekend, if we're going out, maybe we'll do a little bit more. So let's call it 8 hours. Maybe it's a little bit more even. Actually, my original notes, I had X for girls, Y for boys, but I won't be sexist. I'll just say, okay, we're down to 90 hours now, okay, because we have the grooming. Okay, let's see. What's next in my list? Exercise. A sound mind and a sound body. One thing that's been shown over and over again is that exercise has a great effect on being chipper. One of the best antidepressants of all is exercise. And it just makes you more alert. It helps you in just a whole variety of ways. So we need exercise. And then, again, often that's with sports, which also involves elements of friendship as well. Let's say an hour a day. It may not actually be an hour a day. Maybe you'll do a couple of hours some days and alternate that or whatever. But let's at least, say we'll do 7 hours of exercise. Even this one's now going. Okay, so we're down to, still have 83 hours left, so we're doing pretty well here. Okay, besides your friendship with eating and maybe your friendship with sports or exercise, friendship is really an awfully important part of human life. I mean, it's really one of the great joys of human life to have friendship and to spend time with our friends. So we might want to say even in addition to the meals, maybe, at the end of the day, if you're especially on a college campus, you got roommates, friends, maybe at the end of the day you spend an hour having a snack or watching TV or whatever. And then on the weekend, actually, you're likely to have more time. In fact, Friday night, Saturday night, maybe during the day, I'd say, what about, let's say 3 hours a day for Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and an hour for the other days, okay? 3 times 3 is 9, plus 4 is 13, okay? So we're down to, got 13 there. So now down to 70 hours. That's for friendship and other, together with other leisure activities. Okay, so we're at 70 hours now. Okay. Now, you got to figure in, there's a lot of, you got to do errands, you got to walk from, one class to another, from one place to another. That actually mounts up, it's probably, I don't know, at least an hour a day, doing things of that sort. So, let's throw in 7 hours for errands and, just walking places, whatever. So we're down to 63. We spend, many people spend at least part of the day kind of stepping back a little bit and thinking about the big questions in life. And, for many of us, that's our faith. And so, we might spend some part of each day in prayer. We might do some part of each day reading scripture. We might spend, some time in the week, a little bit more on Sunday. You might go to religious services or something like that. Let's say we spend, it's pretty minimal, let's say half an hour a day on things like prayer and reading with maybe an hour on Sunday, okay? So that's another 7 hours, okay? So now we're down to 56 hours. Now, here's where we got a serious question for a lot of people. Not everybody can go through simply on their parents' buck or, with loans. A lot of students have to work. And so that's going to, take up, a chunk of time. It's going to vary a lot. Some kids might work 10 or 12 hours a week. Some people might work 20 hours a week. 20 hours a week is, that's on top of a full, in a way, study is a full-time job. So you want to add another, half-time job, that's pretty tough. Let's say, just as an average 15 hours. That's probably maybe a little bit more. I don't know, but does that sound? Yes. Let's throw it in there anyway. We'll say 15 hours of, employed work, employment. Okay, so we're now down to 41 hours. What else? Put class and study to the side for one moment. Is there anything else that I've left out that we really need to throw in here that doesn't fit in somewhere else? I think this covers most of the things anyway, So that means we have 41 hours, let's say maybe 15 hours for classes, maybe as much as 18. So you're going to end up with something like 26 to 23, is it? Hours of non-class study. And what was the figure I mentioned before? That I think the studies show that college students typically work, I think it's like 3.9 hours a day for class and study. It's 3.9. I'm assuming that's 7 days. I'm not even sure that's 7 days, but let's say it's 7 days. 63, carry 6 is, so 27.3 hours for class and study. Whereas we got 41 hours for class and study. And this is not like, a slave master on your back. There's lots of, lots of room in there for lots of stuff. I mean, we're working, we're exercising, we're spending time with our friends, some time for prayer. So, I mean, the point is this, that there's actually a lot of time in the week. What does this not take into consideration? Wasting time. You have a 9 o'clock class. You have an 11 o'clock class. So what do you do from 10 to 11? Maybe I'll stop by the snack bar. Yeah, go on Facebook, talk with, That is, it's easy to have segments of the day where we just blow off anything, blow off everything, goof off, And the time wasters can be huge, and that can end up really undermining our ability to do the important things. So, it's important, I think, to be on top of ourselves and to ask ourselves, to analyze our lives and ask, how am I using my time? It's not a question, you never want to get into a position where you're kind of viewing the clock as your taskmaster. From 9 o'clock to 10 o'clock I do this. From 10 to 10:15 I do this. From 10:15 to 10:25. I mean, if you do that slavishly, that would make life kind of unenjoyable. But that's not what we're talking about here. We've got lots of times to do, a lot of things. Having that framework actually ends up giving us extra time. What was the phrase you used, Dan? Intelligently lazy? In some ways, if you use time well, you're being intelligently lazy. That is, you can get what you want to get done in less time because you're using your time well. So be intelligently lazy. That is, be intelligent about using your time in such a way that you have time for all the things that you want to do. And don't let time get squandered on other things that are not really that useful or valuable, And again, that's, friendship, spending time with friends, goofing off for an hour with your friends. Things like that are great. I'm not saying that you should never go on Facebook. If you're just on Facebook or just kind of Googling websites for hour after hour, if you're playing video games, if you're watching lousy TV, just to say if you're watching almost any TV, there's not that much good TV. There's a little bit, I guess. But, using our time well is really, really pretty key. Now, I guess the rest has to be saved for Study Skills 3, since we're at the end of Study Skills 2. In some ways, I didn't get to the really, really big questions. And I'll just mention, Study Skills 3 would be about, maybe it will be about someday, setting goals. Setting goals in your life. And what does that mean? Well, it means exactly that. Sitting back and asking yourself, what do you want to accomplish in life? Writing a mission statement for yourself. What is it that, when I die 40 or 50 or 60 years from now, what do I want to say I accomplished? Do I want to be really good at my work? Do I want to be a really good husband and father or mother and, son and daughter, all those different family relationships? Do I want to have good friendships? Do I want to be an intelligent, active citizen? Just lots of things to think about. And coming up with some kind of almost mission statement that identifies the major areas of your life and what you want to accomplish is a very valuable undertaking, because you have those big goals in mind that can really help determine how you should use your time now. So you want to identify the life goals. Then you want to identify maybe, the second step I think would be identifying where do you want to be 3 to 5 years from now. You guys are seniors in high school, so a good example would be, what do I want my goal to be when I'm graduating from college? And actually write down the goals and think of this is what I want to do. Because if you have that in front of you, then as you're making your plans for what to do now, you can be thinking, okay, where do I need to be if that's where I want to be 5 years from now? Then kind of bringing the time frame in again, in a way, the natural kind of framework of a student's life, I suppose, is the semester, right? Your classes usually last a semester or whatever. So what are your goals this semester? You know, both your work goals and your study, your courses, your friendships, your dating. I want to meet somebody who's absolutely wonderful, who falls in love with me madly. Okay, that actually takes work, because you have to actually sort through a lot of people. You know, actually meeting people, spending time with them, all that kind of stuff. And then you work it back again. Do you know, at the beginning of the semester, look at your coursework and identify, when are my papers due? When were my major tests? Kind of fit those into a semester schedule. I know that this weekend I'm going to be actually working on this paper, or this weekend I'm going to have to prepare for this big test. Basically have a blotter that has maybe a 3-month schedule where you actually identify things for those. Then every week you spend half an hour, let's say, planning the week. If the week is your normal framework of study, that usually means Sunday night to Friday, maybe sometimes Saturday, take a half an hour and plan out the week. You might have a general schedule that you have to adjust. Usually I spend this much time studying chem, but this week I got a big sociology test, so I'm going to have to spend more time this week on that and try to identify. I mean, planning is really valuable, and students do it to some extent. They kind of do it haphazardly and often do it in terms of immediate deadlines, the goals that are immediate, and they kind of go from one immediate deadline to another. Far better to step back and have a kind of big picture about the semester, a big picture about the next week, and then try to make your decisions based on that. And there's many more things to be said, but not today. And not this fall, because this is it. Let me just give you